If you like my videos, don't forget to follow me on social media to keep up to date with all the latest news regarding my channel and my content. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe below or at the end of the video. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has become one of the most popular, most successful, and largest film series of all time, comprising so far of 19 movies across 10 separate franchises, which have earned a current total of over $15.5 billion worldwide. That is an enormous feat, considering the series is only just celebrating its 10th anniversary this very year. Next to Star Wars, the MCU is my favourite cinematic franchise ever, and is home to some of my favourite stories, characters, and actors. To say this franchise has turned me into a raging Marvel fanboy is, well, it's true. It's true. In this updated and expanded video, I aim to rank all 19 movies that make up the Marvel Cinematic Universe, including the newly released Avengers Infinity War. From the outset, however, let me stress that this is a list of my own personal favourites, ranged from least favourite to favourite. It's not a list of what I think should be considered the greatest MCU movies from worst to best. That's a list that would be vastly different from mine. Before you watch, remind yourself, everyone's opinions are different, and no two people in the world will ever share the same, and I cannot believe I still have to say this at the beginning of my videos. At that, let us get into it. Here is my personal ranking of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Excelsior! 19. The Incredible Hulk. There's no doubt that The Incredible Hulk is the sore thumb of the MCU. I wouldn't say it's a bad movie, but it's got a lot of bad things going for it. It was produced at a time where Marvel's idea for a cinematic universe was a bit of a gamble, and a lot of things that would later solidify the universe's groundwork are absent here. Although we have a small appearance of Tony Stark, as well as some references to Captain America, Incredible Hulk feels like it makes more of an effort of being a pseudo-sequel to the 2003 Eric Bana Hulk than it does in fitting with the master plan of overarching storytelling that the later movies would employ. As far as Marvel superhero flicks go, it has a fairly lackluster plot, so that certainly doesn't help things. However, the biggest issue I have with this is, of course, Edward Norton. That's not to say that Norton was bad as Bruce Banner. He was actually very good, and in some respects better than Mark Ruffalo. Yet a whole lot of creative differences between Norton and Marvel led to his dismissal from the role. And the fact that Marvel had yet to implement multi-picture deals for their stars to future-proof their franchise meant that it was easy for him to slip away. I feel like this was to the detriment of the movie itself, which often finds itself getting swept under the rug. While a small handful of other characters underwent casting changes, this one hurts the most. It was one of the big ones, a key player in the universe. 18. Thor: The Dark World. Strangely enough, I've always enjoyed Thor: The Dark World more than the first Thor. Yes, I would agree that Thor is the better of the two movies, but this movie marked the first time I actually got excited about Thor as a character and about Thor's world. The movie is pretty choppy and entirely lackluster in hindsight, but I do still enjoy watching this one. My major problem with Dark World, aside from Natalie Portman, my favourite actress phoning in her performance, is the fact that the movie just tries too hard to be too dark. It's what I imagine the MCU would look like as a whole if it were made by the guys running the DCEU. Clearly Marvel learned their errors with this, considering the completely different direction they went with the third Thor movie Ragnarok, which certainly lands much higher on my list. Despite actually enjoying this movie slightly more than the first Thor, I've ranked it lower. Why? Well, for these reasons, of course. 17. Thor. The first phase of the MCU started fairly rocky for me. I was never fully into it until around the back end of the second phase. Movies like the first Thor outing just never really did it for me on initial watch. Over time, this one has certainly grown on me, but it's not a movie that I get incredibly excited about watching during an MCU marathon. Thor was Marvel's first attempt at making an entirely serious movie, which is certainly represented in the fact that the studio hired Shakespeare thespian Kenneth Branagh to helm the movie. Branagh's direction on the movie is beautiful, and to me the best part about this installment. Marvel are also commendable for being able to nab such a high-profile dramatic director to take control of a superhero movie at a time where superhero movies were still fairly fledgling. It was ballsy moves like this that helped build up to the golden age of superhero movies we're now in. While I'm not an enormous fan of the movie, it was always clear that Thor was a step in a different direction for the MCU. It was the first time the franchise really gained its legs and made a statement that they weren't just about generic superhero movies. They were daring and brave enough to aim higher by pushing the boundaries of the genre. For that, it lands just above The Dark World for me. 16. Captain America: The First Avenger. Similar to the first Thor movie, the First Avenger never completely captivated me on first viewing. I found it to be a little bland and somewhat of an underwhelming first installment of a solo superhero franchise, and a fairly middling supernatural war picture. Over time, as my love for the character of Captain America has grown, I've come to appreciate the movie much more. While on first viewing I didn't realize just how important this movie was to the greater MCU, I can now see just how many building blocks this movie offered to the series as a whole. And not just for that first phase, but for the entire MCU going forward. While First Avenger is a pretty important movie in the whole scheme of things, I still just don't feel as much of an attachment or even love for it as I do most of the other movies. 15. Iron Man 2. To me, Iron Man 2 scrapes in as my least favourite Iron Man outing. This feels like the least intimate and heartfelt of the series and doesn't have anywhere near as much soul as the other two. Iron Man 2 doesn't really push many boundaries like future MCU sequels would and just ends up feeling like a generic comic book movie sequel. Iron Man 2 does very little to challenge itself and doesn't really make a huge attempt to further story and character development. As the third movie in the MCU, it was quite clear that Marvel was still playing it safe without making any bold moves. It was almost as if the studio wanted to, above all else, do everything they did with the first Iron Man, but do more of it. At times, it really does just feel like a more overblown version of the first movie. Oh, and let's not forget that before Norton Gate, we had Howard Gate, when Don Cheadle took over the role of James Rhodes from Terrence Howard, and though less noticeable than the Hulk switcheroo, it's still a slight sign of the MCU's shaky beginning. Mind you, Cheadle by far delivers the better performance, so it doesn't really bother me that much. I should, however, give an acknowledgement to Sam Rockwell's awesome performance as Justin Hammer. He's one of my favourite actors and he goes under the radar most of the time, so it's nice to see him in a bigger movie. Also, the first appearance of Black Widow was worth a mention, though she just kind of feels like a throwaway character here. 14. Iron Man 3. While most believe the third installment of the Iron Man trilogy to be the worst, I personally believe it's slightly better than Iron Man 2. On the whole, Iron Man 3 isn't as terrible as people make it out to be. It's actually a very fun and exciting movie with a great deal of awesome action sequences. It may be the most bombastic movie of the lot, but the action sequences are definitely not to the expense of the plot, unlike with the second movie. Iron Man 3 is quite possibly the most intimate and heartfelt Iron Man chapter. While many criticised it for its often slow plot, I commend it for being so daring in the way that it furthers and deconstructs the character of Tony Stark in the aftermath of the Avengers. It was the deep breath the MCU needed directly after the enormous crossover event. In turn, it became the first movie in the MCU to completely show audiences that one movie could affect the outcome or direction of the next, even if they weren't technically from the same sub-franchise. The movie even makes an attempt to give Stark's story a sense of closure, wrapping it all up very nicely, even though that would all be undone in Age of Ultron with very little explanation. Then there's the Mandarin, or Trevor, easily my favourite of the MCU villains so far. While many longtime Iron Man fans decried the twist, I found it refreshing. I mean, the Mandarin isn't all that great in the comics anyway. 13. Black Panther. The most culturally diverse movie in the entire MCU, and perhaps the most diverse Hollywood blockbuster of all time. Black Panther features one of the best casts assembled for a Marvel movie outside of its crossover extravaganzas. The movie is so beautifully inspired by its culture and such a wonderful showcase of it. From its costume and set design to its score, soundtrack, and overall soundscape, and its underlying motifs and symbolisms. I completely admired the cultural aspect of the movie, and as someone who loves African culture, I love the fact that director Ryan Coogler was given such a freedom to represent it so accurately and so gorgeously. And while the movie's diversity is put front and center, never once does it impact on Coogler's storytelling. It humbly exists to complement it. Sadly, the one thing that holds Black Panther back from being one of the MCU greats is its overblown runtime, which suffers from some middling moments and a somehow rushed and underdeveloped final act with a villain that has little credibility. I also felt that the movie tried to squish too many narratives into one. On the whole, I do enjoy Black Panther. It's a great solo movie which escapes getting bogged down as a hype piece for Infinity War, the movie that's set to follow it, by simply being a great, exhilarating adventure. It's truly an innovative and groundbreaking movie, and one that's going to make an enormous impact on culture. A true cultural phenomenon. 12. Doctor Strange. One of the most daring chapters in the MCU, and the one that opened up a million possibilities for the future of the franchise. Doctor Strange showed us that even 14 movies and 8 years in, we still hadn't seen the full potential of the MCU, nor had we seen just how far-reaching, complex, and multi-layered its stories could be. It's not only a movie that changed the way we view the franchise, but one that continues to push everything we ever knew about storytelling in cinema. The idea of the multiverse is one that's existed in printed form for decades, but one which has always been thought too confusing to work on the screen. Clearly, if anyone can make it work, it's Marvel. Doctor Strange is an amazing showcase of special effects, which serve the story instead of overshadowing it, and is an incredibly exhilarating and stimulating thrill ride. It's easily one of the best cinematic debuts for a comic book character ever, but ultimately it just falls outside of my top 10 MCU films. Benedict Cumberbatch is fantastic as Stephen Strange, and once again showed just how revered the MCU has become, if it can attract an Academy Award nominee to sign onto a multi-picture comic book movie deal. How about them apples? I don't know why I said that. 11. SpiderMan Homecoming. Homecoming is notable for being one of the only times in history two major studios actually worked together to make a movie, and the results of that partnership, which by all accounts puts most creative work in the hands of Marvel, were absolutely stellar. Spider-Man has been a favourite character of mine since I was a kid, yet sadly through a string of poor movies I lost interest in the character until Marvel was able to breathe into him a fresh life. Tom Holland brings a unique spark to the character of Peter Parker, a funny, smart-ass kid struggling through high school, and one actually played by a kid and not a moody 30-year-old. The movie finally portrayed the character the way we'd always deserved. There was some controversy surrounding the appearance of Tony Stark in the movie, but I just felt he was used perfectly. He had just the right amount of screen time and wasn't used excessively. The movie needed an established character like Stark to drive this Spider-Man reboot in the right direction. It's certainly a great MCU entry, but not one of the greatest. That said, it just scrapes in as a top 10 entry for me. Oh, and let's not forget that Michael Keaton is in here. Marvel, you can do no wrong. 10. Avengers Age of Ultron. Okay, this one's probably my most guilty pleasure out of the entire MCU. I understand it's not a perfect movie and has a great deal of flaws and narrative problems, but that's not enough to stop me from enjoying it. After 10 movies and 5 years, Marvel deserved the right to produce a movie that was just plain and simply a blockbuster, a piece of cinematic escapism. Of course, there are some great character moments in the movie, such as our first proper exploration of Clint Barton as a three-dimensional character, but there are also some horrible character moments like a terribly lackluster Ultron and an out-of-left-field romance. But it's still a movie that I admire deeply. This was the point where I fell head over heels with the MCU. Only a casual viewer up until this point, it was almost like all the pieces just fell together as the movie finally worked towards setting up both Captain America Civil War and Avengers Infinity War. We also got some great new characters here who were clearly being set up as the torch holders of the next generation of the franchise. Sure, it all boils down to a movie that may just exist as a 2.5-hour piece of exposition for the franchise's future and the beginning of the story's major culminations, but I just don't care. It's the movie that helped me fall in love with the MCU and build up my anticipation for its future in ways I could never imagine. 9. AntMan. Perhaps simply one of the most fun Marvel movies out of the entire bunch. Ant-Man is like a breath of fresh air in the MCU, one that kind of stands on its own amongst a bunch of movies whose agendas were to push forward the narrative of the franchise. Ant-Man is a smaller film that exists just as a piece of escapism. Doesn't take itself too seriously at any point. I mean, for a movie about a guy whose super strength is shrinking to the size of an ant, it really couldn't. Again, this was another sign that Marvel could push boundaries and make something special out of a character who, on paper, sounded like the lamest superhero ever invented. They even took a chance at picking a comedic actor to jump into the supersuit, and damn did it work. Paul Rudd is one of the greatest casting choices in the entire MCU. Not only does he make the role super funny, but he brings a depth and humanity and everyday guy feel to Scott Lang, something that the character really needed if he were to make a connection with audiences. Marvel did what they do best with Ant-Man and made a movie that was just straight up fun, and created one of the absolute best debut movies for a superhero. Oh, and Michael Douglas is in here too. Marvel, you can do no wrong. 8. Guardians of the Galaxy. Talking about fun and ballsy moves, Guardians of the Galaxy came at a time where Marvel had finally established their MCU as a global juggernaut and had won over audiences. It was time for them to start taking some major risks and playing with audience expectations. Guardians was Marvel's first enormous gamble, the first movie that wasn't an entry in one of the pre-existing sub-franchises. With the complete trust of their audience, Marvel released a movie about a B-team of superheroes, which included a walking, talking tree and a raccoon, to become a box office smash and multi-record breaker. Just like Ant-Man later would, Guardians took the MCU to a whole new level of fun and inspired and reshaped the movies that followed it. With the mind of ingenious director James Gunn and one of the best soundtracks of all time behind it, Guardians really did continue to prove that Marvel were able to constantly redefine the superhero genre. Perhaps the most daring thing Marvel did with Guardians, however, was the fact that they used the movie, their most obscure yet, as one of the most important movies in the franchise. It not only gave us our first major introduction to the saga's big bad Thanos, but was also the first movie to explicitly explain and detail the Infinity Stones. Really, it was the movie that catapulted the franchise into its eventual trajectory, building up hype for the series climax, which at that point was still 4 or 5 years away. 7. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Whilst being the film that takes us the farthest away from Earth and deals with all-powerful extra-dimensional beings, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is probably the most down-to-earth and most human story in the entire MCU. The movie not only breaks down the characters, but breaks down everything we thought we knew about the franchise. Where the first movie literally drives the MCU into a new trajectory, the second is another short pause for Marvel, one where the characters get a proper chance to establish and build before being thrown in with the Avengers for Infinity War. Sure, it may not necessarily be a better movie than the first, and certainly wasn't as groundbreaking, but this movie struck a certain chord for me. The emotionality and incredible focus on character and narrative establishment in it just grabs me, unlike any of the other movies. It's not just an action thrill ride, but an emotional one too, and for someone who loves movies that focus on narrative and character above all else, Guardians was near perfect to me. And with another incredible soundtrack to take it home, the movie still finds time to be exciting and thrilling. With Guardians 2, James Gunn continues to prove what an exceptional storyteller he is. Oh, and damn it if Baby Groot isn't the cutest thing I've seen in my whole life. Marvel, you can do no wrong. 6. Thor Ragnarok. With Thor Ragnarok, Marvel took their most troubled franchise and completely flipped it on its head, in effect giving it somewhat of a soft reboot. As soon as it was announced that Taika Waititi was steering the ship, all bets were off with this chapter in Thor's story. Despite Waititi being one of my favourite directors, even I wasn't too sure how I thought about him tackling arguably the darkest, most serious Thor film so far. While the past Thor installments were either too dramatic or too dark, Ragnarok turned out to be the polar opposite. It was bright, colourful, entertaining, and absolutely hilarious. I'm gonna use that word again. It was actually fun. Ragnarok was exactly what the character and his franchise needed to finally get up on its feet. It's not a direction that was incredibly obvious for the character, but one that works so well. Harkening back to classic Jack Kirby artwork from the 1960s, Ragnarok is not just an exciting adventure, but it's a total feast for the eyes. Without Portman there to drag the mood down, the movie adds new characters like Valkyrie, who are more fitting alongside Thor and help raise the movie's spirits. The inclusion of Hulk is also ingenious, with a soft adaptation of Planet Hulk working as a subplot to the movie. In fact, because Marvel don't have solo movie rights to the character, it's even been said that this is the beginning of a Hulk trilogy arc which will sneakily run through various Marvel movies. Again, another clever idea from Marvel, and something that's not quite been tackled this way in cinema before. Oh, and did I mention that this movie comes with added Goldblum? Marvel, you can do no wrong. I promise you that is the last time I'll say that in this video. 5. Captain America Civil War. Civil War is quite easily the biggest event movie we've had in the MCU so far. It was an absolute treat to get a movie which was somewhat advertised as an Avengers 2.5 only a year after the release of Age of Ultron, and one that was quite literally a precursor to Infinity War, building the hype even more. The thing that I love so much about Civil War was not that on the surface it appeared to be another Avengers movie, it was that despite of that, it did such a good job at actually making this feel like the third Captain America movie that it was. Cap's story storyline could have easily been lost inside this overstuffed superhero epic, but to the credit of screenwriters Joe and Anthony Russo, Cap's character and world establishment shone above everything else. It addressed loose ends from Winter Soldier and wrapped them up nicely, and the further exploration of Bucky's character was brilliant. What also astounded me was how much this also felt like it could have easily been Iron Man 4, as it seemed to have an equal focus put onto Tony Stark, whose story arc had somewhat been tangled between Iron Man 3 and Age of Ultron. Even more so, Civil War juggles its 10 existing heroes so well, in most cases actually providing character development for each and every one of them, much better than Ultron did. Not only that, but it introduced 2 new major characters into the mix so seamlessly. Civil War stands as a testament to great storytelling and how enormous ensemble pieces can work perfectly with the right writers. 4. The Avengers. Before Civil War and Infinity War were even a thought in the minds of Marvel fans, the Avengers was the absolute pinnacle of the MCU. The one film above all others that audiences were anticipating, and the one whose success the future longevity of the franchise would rest upon. It was not only the first Marvel movie to mash together all of their existing properties into one crossover event, but it was practically the first movie ever to do it to this extent. Sure, there had been mash-up movies in the past, but none that so brilliantly took a handful of existing franchises and combined their ongoing stories in a way that not only benefited the solo movies, but moved forward the narrative of what has become the largest film franchise in history. It was the kind of comic book movie that studios had been struggling to find a way to make for decades, and one which certain studios are still struggling to make now. It was the movie which showed that Marvel had cracked the code after only 5 movies in 4 years. Build your characters, make the audience fall in love with them, and then, and only then, throw them together for a purpose. This meant that beloved characters could briefly drift in and out of each other's worlds without the need for every character to be given exposition in the one movie. The groundwork was already done, and all it was time for was the payoff. A fast-paced adventure which kicks off right from the opening sequence and doesn't stop to take a breath once at its 2-hour runtime. Kinda like me right now. While I probably enjoy Civil War more, I can't help but overlook the pure magnificence that was the Avengers when it was first released. And even now, how other superhero franchises are still struggling to live up to its success. It was unique then and completely and totally inimitable 6 years on. 3. Iron Man. He's the one that kicked off the MCU with a bang. A multi-million-dollar movie so ambitious that it was made independently, starred a notorious lead actor that no big studio would touch, and focused on a B-grade superhero who'd never made it to the big screen before. It was a recipe for disaster, yet one which ultimately took audiences by storm. In a time where comic book movies were either poorly produced box office bombs or dark and gloomy dramas, Iron Man dared to be different. It was a superhero movie which found time to put complete focus on character development and narrative structure, yet one that didn't take itself too seriously and wasn't afraid to be funny. Iron Man was a superhero flick that didn't shy away from basing itself within the real world, but at the same time one which still required its audience to suspend their belief. It was one of the most stylish, unique, and entertaining superhero movies ever made, and Robert Downey Jr.'s charismatic performance as Tony Stark not only won over audiences, but resurrected his career. It also made way for a fan favourite character, and one I have a huge love for, despite his enormous flaws. Though the movie was a test to see how well a cinematic universe would work, it never took its focus off its main goal of telling one fantastic, self-contained story, albeit with a couple of clever little Easter eggs to build hype and intrigue amongst audiences. This was something audiences realised and appreciated, and something they continue to appreciate to this day. It was the first sign of the grand storytelling that Marvel have employed over the last 10 years without ever rushing once towards an end goal. I love Iron Man. It's the movie I can pinpoint to as the one that reignited my love for the comic book movie, and one without which one of my favourite franchises, the MCU, would not exist. And for that, I am incredibly grateful. At number 2, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. No matter how much I admire Iron Man, nothing can top the way I felt when I first watched The Winter Soldier. I was never all that into the first Captain America movie and went into The Winter Soldier with some pretty low expectations. However, from the movie's first action sequence, I was completely captivated. That feeling I felt when I first watched Iron Man flooded back. Winter Soldier was one of the major tipping points for the MCU, which dramatically changed the tonality of the series and showed audiences that the MCU could change tone and genre from picture to picture and still work. still feel like it's all still happening in the same shared universe. What I admire so enormously about Winter Soldier is how daring it was in stripping back pretty much everything we'd come to know about the MCU at that point. It's possibly the bravest movie in the entire franchise. A political espionage thriller set within a comic book world. Who would have ever thought we wanted that? It was one that was obviously written so incredibly that it even attracted one of Hollywood's greats, Robert Redford, to the role of the movie's main villain. The movie's story is so well thought out and so perfectly executed that it's no wonder the Russo brothers have been handed all of the franchise's tentpole movies since this point. The exploration not only of Cap's past, but of his struggles to fit in with the modern world is an absolute highlight of the movie series, as are many of the movie's heart-pumping action sequences, which really showed off the capability of the MCU at this point. Winter Soldier is such a riveting and explosive movie that continually thrills me no matter how many times I view it. The Winter Soldier is not just a perfect comic book movie, but a perfect movie full stop. It's the perfect example of just how special the Marvel Cinematic Universe can be. And coming in as my #1 movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Avengers Infinity War. Regardless of how perfect the Winter Soldier may be, Avengers Infinity War defied all expectations by becoming one of the most ambitious, daring, and unique movies of all time. Infinity War marks the beginning of the culmination of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's first 10 years. A movie which works as a capsule of everything that makes the MCU what it is, throwing together characters from across 10 franchises and 19 movies in a way that has been unprecedented in over 100 years of cinema. The movie once again proves Marvel's incredibly strenuous formula, and shows that patience and longevity are absolute key when it comes to world building. A movie which acts as a love letter and a payoff for fans who have devoted and invested so much into this franchise for a decade. Playing out like a crossover event comic, the movie plays out like a crossover event comic, where each franchise gets its own moments to shine in ways that are so reminiscent and respectful of their own individual movies. The segments with the Guardians of the Galaxy feel like a Guardians movie. The segments with Doctor Strange feel ripped right out of his own solo adventure. The sequences in Wakanda feel like a Black Panther sequel. From the stylistic and thematic elements to the score and the writing, everything is allowed to continue with its own artistic integrity instead of conforming to one single style, and somehow it works so perfectly. And when everything converges, it's like everything we ever dreamed of finally coming true. The movie is bigger than the Avengers and more ambitious than Civil War, making those two staples of superhero filmmaking look like underwhelming comic book fare. With an enormous cast of characters, the Russo brothers once again proved that they're the kings of the comic book genre, capable of making the impossible possible, effortlessly juggling screen time between the heroes, each of which managed to further their development and story arcs. Avengers Infinity War is everything I love about the MCU rolled up into one explosive little package. And at that, I come to an end of my ranking of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Agree with anything I said? Disagree with all of it? Fire away in the comments below. If you feel the need to abuse me because I liked a movie that you didn't, go ahead. However, just consider how unheroic you will appear to your fellow fans. And if anyone feels the need to ask me where Deadpool was on my list, I just can't. I can't be dealing with that. If you're a first time viewer of my channel and you've liked what you've seen, please hit that big old subscribe button up on your screen right now. To all my regular viewers, thanks again for joining me, and to absolutely everybody out there, don't forget to hit the like button down below. It does a great deal in getting my videos out there. Until next time though, true believers, take care and have a marvelous day. Excelsior!